Essentially today I will be speaking about the construction of the Muslim enemy, as the title says, from the Crusades to 9/11. And the point I'm going to be making, I think, is a simple one, which is that Islamophobia is not about Islam, it is about politics. That is to say, certain images of the Muslim enemy have been mobilized in the West, not because Islam has certain characteristics that make it, antithetical to the West or what have you, but because it's been politically expeditious for ruling elites to actually do this at certain moments in time. And I emphasize certain moments in time because I don't want you to get the impression that somehow there has always been a clash between East and West and the two have never gotten along and so on and so forth. I'm going to argue against that proposition because in fact, for long periods of time, you have seen mutual respect and not just tolerance, but a coming together, for instance, of intellectuals to produce knowledge that is vitally important for human history. All of this I will be covering. But at the same time, I do want to point out that at certain moments, and some of which I will be covering in this talk, it has become useful to mobilize this enemy image. Now, when I do this long view, I'm only taking on a millennium in this talk in, I don't know, about 45 minutes or so. Necessarily, I will be not able to go into any detail in terms of the nuance, right? So for instance, this image of the Muslim enemy actually is not the same across a millennium. It changes at different periods, in different places. And in fact, even at one particular point in time, what it looks like in the political sphere is very different from the representation, for instance, in popular culture, in novels, or in the religious sphere, and so on. And all of that is important to study. But if we get lost in the details, we miss the larger picture. And so that's the point of my talk today, as well as the reason why I wrote this book, is for us to be able to see through, to look through these constructions and actually see the humanity of the people who are being demonized in the ways that I'm going to describe. So I'm not going to start with the Crusades. I'm actually going to start with the present moment, a moment we're familiar with, which is the post-9/11 moment, to talk about how we have been trained to think about Muslims after the events of 9/11. So this is an ad. It was really an ad. Sometimes people giggle when I show this ad because they can't believe, they think it's an onion spoof or something. But it was a real ad run by this Republican in Florida in 2010. Watch it, and then we'll talk about it.
بس كيف رح ياخذ الشهادة إذا كمشوني؟
هذا هدفنا. بعد ما تقتل الكفار كلهم سلم نفسك. ساعتها بنعوز الله القوانين تبعهم، المحاميين تبعهم، الاخبار، التلفزيون، كله نوصل رسالتنا للعالم كله. ساعتها هذا طريقنا الوحيد للسماء.
My name's Dan Finelli. Send me to Washington and I'll send our enemies where they belong, and that's not to a courtroom. Does this look like a terrorist? Or this? It's time to stop this political correctness and the invasion of our privacy. Let's face it, if a good-looking, ripped guy without much hair was flying airplanes into the Twin Towers, I'd have no problem being pulled out of line at the airport. This is an airplane, and this is a terrorist. Send me to Washington and get rid of that bum Alan Grayson, and I'll make sure guys like this get nowhere near things like this.
The good news is Dan Finelli lost. But that, unfortunately, is the only good news. Now, this ad, I thought, is evocative in that it is very straightforward. There's no subtlety here. It is extremely obvious in terms of the message that is being given. Arabs and Muslim, and particularly brown men, terrorists. And in case you didn't get that in the first 30 seconds of the ad, let us put an older white gentleman and point to you and say, does this look like a terrorist? And you're supposed to say, no, of course not, because we don't know that white supremacist groups have actually been growing in the United States since the events of 9/11. We will pretend that white supremacists haven't terrorized and killed all sorts of people who don't fit into this country, over the decades and so on and so forth. Let's forget about all of that. And by the way, just as an aside, there was a lot of, discussion, there was a lot of media attention around the Boston bombing, as there should be. What didn't make the news was a BBC report where the two Boston bombers, the older Tsarnaev guy, actually was an avid white supremacist. He had subscribed to white supremacy journals. He was an equal opportunity hater, believing that, Hitler actually got it right, and so on and so forth. This was not what we talked about. For the most part, it was the fact that they were Muslim, right? So anyway, this is the sort of systematic sort of profiling of some people for their actions as opposed to others. Now, Islamophobia, I want to quickly explain what this term actually means before going further. There is both, it's anti-Muslim racism, I'm sure you got that by now, but there's both a biological and a cultural dimension to this. That is, the people who we see as terrorists tend to be brown men. That is, they tend to be South Asian, Middle Eastern, or North African, right? It's not a coincidence that when we think of the term terrorist and when we think of the cultural representations, we don't think of Indonesian men, even though Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country in the world, right? We think of the Middle East, and this is not a coincidence. This particular construction is rooted in the interests of the United States, and I'm going to come to that shortly. So there is that biological dimension to this form of racism, but it is largely a form of cultural racism in the sense that we are taught that the culture that Islam breeds, the culture that Islam creates in Muslim-majority countries is such that these people are so backwards, they are so misogynistic, they're so unlike us, they are so violent that we should respond to them as others, as people who are not like us in all sorts of ways because of the culture of Islam. And so I want to begin really by talking about this notion of clash of civilizations. Clash of civilizations is a term that the Orientalist scholar Bernard Lewis coined back in 1990, but it was for the political scientist Samuel Huntington to then take up this term and write an essay with the question mark, Clash of Civilizations, and then an entire book called Clash of Civilizations. In a nutshell, here is what it comes down to. Huntington argues that in the post-Cold War world, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, conflict is no longer going to be political, it is going to be cultural. And he says that there are 7 or 8 civilizations that make up the face of the earth, and some of them, like the Islamic and the Confucian, are just so different from the West that there is no choice but to have a clash between these two civilizations, as it were. And the cultures are so, first of all, so unique and isolated from one another, and furthermore, so antithetical that we're going to see a clash of civilization as the key form of conflict in the post-Cold War world. Now, I'm obviously going to argue that this is not a clash of civilizations, that in fact the Muslim enemy is a construction, that these are historically rooted constructions mobilized by the elite, and finally that the main goal is to justify larger political agendas. Now, just very quickly, in terms of the supposed cultural values that define the West versus those that define the East, this is from Huntington's book. He says, Western ideas of individualism, liberalism, constitutionalism, human rights, equality, liberty, the rule of law, democracy, free markets, separation of church and state, apple pie, granny, everything that's wonderful is, of course, part of the West. And as you might imagine, the East, and particularly Islamic societies, are backward, they are static, they are misogynistic, and so on and so forth. And therefore, it is the white man's burden, and I'll come back to this concept later, to go off and civilize them. I'm going to argue against, obviously, this entire thesis, but let me go back to the beginning. And that is early contact between East and West. Islam as a religion emerged in the 7th century in the Hijaz region of Arabia. And in a matter of decades, Muslim armies were able to defeat the large and powerful neighboring empires, the Persian and Byzantine empires. And by the 8th century, they had actually entered Europe. And the conquest began in Spain and then continued through the entire Iberian Peninsula, reaching all the way to Italy. Now, of course, this drew alarm in Europe. But at this point, Norman Daniel, who's one of the preeminent scholars of this period, argues that the Muslim invaders were seen as no different from any other invaders of this period. In fact, he characterizes the first 400 years of contact as the age of ignorance, where nobody in Europe even knew who the Prophet Muhammad was, let alone had any stories about the Muslim enemy. In fact, they were just seen as no different from the Northmen, the Slavs, the Magyars, and so on, all of these other barbarians who were knocking on the gates of their kingdoms. And so in the 11th century, this begins to change. This begins to actually yield to a much more sharp image of this Muslim enemy. Why? Because the others, the Normans, the Magyars, the Slavs, and so on, had been put down and they had been converted and largely integrated. And the only enemy that actually remained were the Muslims and their various kingdoms. And so what we see is a process not simply of conquest, right, and the establishment of what would be called al-Andalus, which I'll come to shortly, and the taking over of European lands by the Muslims, but also a process of conversion. Over a course of, decades and actually centuries, large numbers of Christians and Jews would actually, convert. At least significant numbers would convert, so that it drew alarm from the leadership. They wanted to know why this was happening, and they certainly didn't like that this was happening, and in fact saw Islam as an existential threat to them. So it's in this context that the Vatican actually sets up a commission, sets up scholarship to find ways to defeat this new enemy. And the lines of attack would be the following. One, that Islam's revelations were, quote unquote, pseudo-prophecies, that Muhammad was a false prophet, and that Islam is inherently violent. Now, today, of course, the first two have no resonance in our society, unless you're Glenn Beck or, one of the right-wingers who continue to, tout these lines. But the third has endured right up to the present. And I want to say a little bit about this third idea. So this came into being primarily, though not exclusively, in the context of people converting to Islam. And so the explanation was given that this was happening because people were being forced. They were being forced and coerced through the threat of violence to actually convert. That is the only reason they would be giving up our religion, right? In fact, that was not true. I'm not going to say that there was no violence. Absolutely, there was violence. This was a time of war and conquest. Everyone was attacking one another. But conversion violence, very little. And that's not because somehow Muslims are better people than Christians or what have you, but it's simply based on a recognition among Muslims that Judaism and Christianity were previous versions of a religion from the same God. Right? They just happened to believe that the prophet got the right revelations and that their religion was therefore the better one. And so they saw their Jewish and Christian brothers and sisters as, people of the same faith in general. And so you could pay a tax. You could keep your religion and you could pay a tax and you didn't get killed or persecuted. You weren't an infidel in the way that Jews would actually get persecuted and forced to convert and so on and so forth. The other way in which actually, it's comical, the other way in which it was explained as to why people are converting is because Islam actually allows men to marry 4 women. It allows for divorce, and it even allows divorced women to remarry. And for the papacy, this was terrible. Oh my God, marriage is supposed to be one woman, one man till death and destruction do us apart. And so the idea of, divorce being permitted, the idea of marrying 4 women and so on. And so this became an explanation, is that Islam permits sexual indulgences, right? And actually from that point on, you see this really strange relationship between Europe and the East, where on the one hand, it's a sort of projection of repressed sexual fantasies onto the harem, and what might be happening that I'm missing out on, for crying out loud. And on the other hand, a sort of revulsion, and that revulsion actually begins to set in around the 19th century or so. And that's a completely different talk, which I don't have the time to actually indulge you in right now. So let me stick to a summary of how this attack against Islam was waged. You can read, so I'll let you read. A renegade Christian priest, apparently. Sexually promiscuous, adulterer, licentious, depravity. And apparently he died horribly, suffocated by dogs or pigs during an epileptic fit. I mean, my God, how much worse can it get? And of course, popular novels at the time reflected these themes. But anyway, this was the kind of systematic propaganda that was unleashed at this time. And the question is why? All of a sudden, why was there a need to produce this kind of propaganda? Well, two agendas which are political. The Reconquista, which is the term given to the reconquest of Spain. I mentioned earlier how the Muslim armies had actually taken all of the Iberian Peninsula and had actually even reached into Italy and set up a kingdom. And it was time now for various kings in the region to take back that the name given to this process of taking the lands back, which would ultimately happen in 1492 with the expulsion not just of the Muslims, but also of the Jews from Spain. So this was one of the political motivations for creating this enemy image. And the other, of course, was the Crusades, which was the holy war called by the Pope to liberate Jerusalem from the infidels. Now, of course, scholars who look at the Crusades have argued that even this original holy war wasn't really about religion. It was in fact about creating a united Christian Europe so that brother would stop fighting brother, and to establish papal control over a united Christian Europe, and then to extend that power into the Middle East through the Byzantine Empire, through the Christian Byzantine Empire and so forth. So even back then, it was about power. It was not so much about religion, but religion becomes the vehicle by which to justify this and to excite people. That said, not everyone who joined the Crusades were actually driven by religious fervor. There was booty. There were all sorts of complicated reasons for why people joined. Okay, so I've spent a lot of time talking about the sort of poisonous, pernicious image of Muslims that would drive people to join armies, march to Jerusalem, kill along the way. And by the way, the first group of people who were systematically targeted during the Crusades were, anyone know? Jews in Germany. That was the first pogrom against Jews, and that was the first sort of mass killing in the context of the Crusades. At any rate, even though there was this kind of horrible attitude towards Muslims, at the same time, though, we have to recognize that among populations of Christians and Jews who lived in al-Andalus, and al-Andalus is the name given to the 800-year Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula, what was happening at this point is that while Europe had gone into what are called the Dark Ages, which is a period of economic, political, and social decline, these kingdoms were in fact on the rise. And so they were sort of, people in Europe, people in Cordoba, for instance, enjoyed street lighting and running water, as you will hear from the next clip I have to show you. And in this context, therefore, it's not surprising that Europeans who are not Muslims would not have a negative attitude towards the Moors. This is the term given to Spanish Muslims. In fact, this is a quote from one Christian writer at the time, and he's complaining. He says, quote, "The Christians love to read the poems and romances of the Arabs. They study the Arab theologians and philosophers, not to refute them, but to form a correct and elegant Arabic. Where is the layman now who reads the Latin commentaries on the Holy Scriptures, or who studies the Gospels or prophets or apostles? Alas, all talented young Christians read and study with enthusiasm are the Arab books. They gather immense libraries at great expense. They despise the Christian language as unworthy of attention. They have forgotten their language. For everyone who can write a letter in Latin to a friend, there is 1,000 who can express themselves better in Arabic with elegance and write better poems in this language than the Arabs themselves. Well, we'll let that part go. But you know what I mean. He is lamenting the loss of Latin and so forth. I think it is actually looking at real history like this that we can actually debunk the idea that somehow there is a culture unique to the West, which is Roman and Greek civilization, and then there was nothing, and then we have the Renaissance, right? In fact, that's not true. In fact, the Renaissance or the rebirth in Europe would not have happened had it not been for the translation and the development of all of these works of human knowledge. So very much East and West have been intertwined and have shaped each other's development in all sorts of integral ways. Also, I want to emphasize that the political elite, in fact, have not, even though they mobilize these sorts of images of the other to sort of galvanize public opinion, doesn't mean they didn't cooperate with each other. Even back during the Crusades, there were Christians who worked and made alliances with Muslim rulers, and Muslim rulers who, stabbed each other in the back to get ahead, and Christian rulers who stabbed each other in the back, and so on. This exists right through this period of time that I'm talking about. In fact, going all the way up to the Ottoman Empire, it was a very powerful empire. Sides were taken in Europe, and in fact, the Ottomans would side with the Reformation against the seat of Catholicism, which was the Habsburg Empire, and various ruling elites would actually go and make these alliances with the Ottomans. In fact, actually, if you look at the literature at the time, the Ottomans were admired in Europe. They were seen as European cousins of sorts. Their administrative policies were greatly appreciated and admired, and people want to emulate them and be like them. But this only lasts up until a certain point. In fact, up until the 17th century, while the Ottomans were admired by the Europeans, this would change after the 17th century, not simply because they would have defeats, such as in Vienna and elsewhere, but comparatively, they would begin a process of economic, social, and political decline compared to Europe, which was going through an era of capitalist ascendancy, and which would see all sorts of advantages come out of that, including advantages of travel, munitions, communication, and so on and so forth. And this would lay the groundwork for the process of colonization that would begin in earnest in modern society in the 19th century. And so it's to that moment that I turn next. And at this point, all the awe, all the admiration that existed for the Ottomans is now gone. And instead, a new vocabulary was born to talk about the East, particularly what's called the Near East. And centers for the study of the Orient begin to get set up in France, in the UK, in Belgium, et cetera, and what these centers do is they produce a systematic body of knowledge, which the scholar Edward Said refers to as Orientalism. And what Orientalism is, really, he argues, is a certain understanding of the Middle East, which is really not a reflection of what that region is like, but is an imagined geography. It is a certain kind of projection of what it is thought to be in order to pave the way for colonialism, in order to justify colonialism. So in fact, when Napoleon actually invades Egypt in 1798, he takes with him not just an army of soldiers, he also takes with him an army of scholars. He takes, about 65 or so scholars who are very integrally tied to his mission of colonizing Egypt, and they produce these encyclopedic knowledge. They do produce encyclopedias, some of which is really useful material, but a lot of it, and the point that Edward Said makes, is that this was not knowledge meant for use by the Egyptians. This was knowledge meant for use by the French in order to better subjugate, in order to better colonize the Egyptian people. And so part of what develops is this very polarized notion of East and West. Similar, really, to what I explained earlier is the clash of civilizations. In fact, clash of civilization really is neo-Orientalism. So I'm not going to explain it again. I'm simply instead going to refer to the notion of the white man's burden. People know that this is the title of a poem by Rudyard Kipling, the British poet. And in it, he describes the native as half devil, half child. And what does he mean by that? What he means is that on the one hand, they are so unknowable, they are so unrecognizable, they are so opaque to us in the West that they are demonic, they are devil-like, and therefore violence against them to subjugate them is justified. On the other hand, they are also not as advanced as us, they are not as civilized as us, and so we must uplift them. And it was the white man's burden to drag them out of the darkness in which they live and to civilize them and to bring them into modernity and so forth. And I want you to keep that in mind because you see, just like you see a reflection of Orientalism today in the form of clash of civilizations, you also see the white man's burden come up again and again in various contexts. People should talk about Syria, if you like, in the discussion. Now, the US, finally to the US, and this is the last part of my presentation. The US is a late arriving power in the Middle East. For the most part, we in this country do not have the same vocabulary of Orientalism. Where we do, it comes through Hollywood. It comes through films like The Sheikh, if you have seen that, a couple of Sheikh films, Rudolph Valentino, and so forth. It comes through exhibitions, traveling sort of exhibitions where you're taught how to appreciate the other, as it were. But in fact, systematic knowledge would not be produced until after World War II, because that is the moment at which the US would take over the reins of control from Britain and France. And fundamentally, of course, the Western interest in the Middle East, particularly after World War I, where, as Lord Curzon puts it, quote, the Allies floated to victory on a sea of oil. This is World War I. Interest in oil becomes the primary reason for subjugation, for colonialism, for occupation in the Middle East. And that is, in fact, exactly what the United States is interested in the region. At first, you have the post-war petroleum order, which is not about oil for domestic consumption in the United States, but about trying to get cheap oil to Europe in order for the Marshall Plan, which is the process of recovery of Europe, to actually proceed, and so for cheap energy resources to actually reach them. And this involved a kind of order that was not simply about the oil-producing nations, but the nations through which oil was going to be transported as well, and hence Egypt, Suez, etc. This is the context in which, of course, those who do not cooperate with the US's agenda in the Middle East get constructed as extremists, and those who do are moderates. Always the term moderate is, who agrees with us? And if you do, then you're a moderate. And if by some chance you have a disagreement, whether you're on the far right or on the far left, you become an extremist. And as we know, it's just terrible to be an extremist because it's always better to be in the middle. Now, the image of the Islamic terrorist or of the Muslim as being particularly demonic comes to life after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. This was in the context of the US-backed Shah being overthrown by a genuine people's movement that involved students, it involved workers, it involved poets, it involved religious minorities. It was a mass popular movement that led to his overthrow. But eventually it was Ayatollah Khomeini who actually, some people argue led the counter-revolution, who actually sort of vanquished all other forces and then established control for himself. And so Khomeini actually came to be seen as the personification of everything evil. So here is a visual depiction of this. Now, I disagree with Khomeini's politics. I really dislike the turn that the Iranian Revolution took under him. But this is ridiculous. Because what it does is, this is a caricature, right? Literally, this is a sketch. This is not an actual picture of this man. And it's a sketch made to make him look demonic. He's pale. He's got these jaundiced eyes. He looks fierce. He looks so opaque and irrational that nothing he says should be taken seriously. In contrast, East versus West, we have, for people who don't recognize that man, that is Jimmy Carter. He used to be president at the time and has since, by the way, taken a bunch of positions against what he stood for back then. There you have it, the angelic Jimmy Carter. He literally has a halo on his head, right? His face is glowing. He looks warm, welcoming. So there we have the God and devil images. And of course, when you present it this way, then you can't have a rational conversation. You can't talk about why the Iranian people might be angry with the United States, why some students might have taken hostage for 444 days personnel in the US embassy. The hostage crisis was front page headline news, and it established a certain idiom about how Iranians, how Muslims, and how the Middle East would be looked at, and that is through the eyes of mobs. These are irrational, angry mobs who for absolutely no reason are angry with the United States. On the other side, the hostages, their families, were given front page coverage. Their dreams, their aspirations, their sorrows, their tragedies were talked about, whereas the motivations of the Iranians were completely ignored. That is the process of dehumanization. When you take out of the equation that perhaps Iranians are angry because when their head of state, Mohammad Mossadegh, actually tried to nationalize, democratically elected, mind you, tried to nationalize the oil industry and use their resources for the development of their own people, the CIA orchestrated a coup, got rid of him, and the Shah was placed, who, by the way, banned all other political parties except his own and ruled with an iron fist. Savak was, trained by the CIA. Savak is the secret police. Torture was, used against dissidents. Democracy was squashed in all sorts of ways. Now, would that make you angry? Is that a rational basis to be angry with what the United States has done? Of course, but when that's not in the picture, when human beings and their actions are not given to you in the form of rational actions, then it's easy to dehumanize them and it's easy to ignore the reasons why they do this. And by the way, this is not a narrative that ended in the 1980s after the release of the hostages. If you didn't see Argo, I was going to say, go see it, but I don't know if I want you to go see it. It's up to you. I leave it to you. But it won the best film, right, at the Oscars. And I will, hand it to Ben Affleck. He spent the first, 40 seconds talking about the CIA overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953 and spending all of another 1 minute humanizing Iranian people. But the rest of the film is all about these people have absolutely no reason for doing this to our people. There's only one sympathetic character, and that is the woman who works at the Canadian embassy. And why is she good? Because she's a moderate. She's on our side, right? And so that's the way in which people get presented. Good Muslim, bad Muslim, as Mahmoud Mamdani put it, is people who are on our side versus the wrong side. I want to say a little bit about terrorism and where this discourse of terrorism actually comes from. Now, the word itself has been used at least since the 19th century. But I don't want to do such a long history of it. Instead, I'm just going to speak about its usage in the post-Second World War era. What you see at this time is that after the Second World War, there are decolonization struggles that sweep the globe from India to Algeria. And a term that comes to be used by the colonial powers is those who are fighting for self-determination are terrorists. Why? Because in some instances, they actually do resort to coercion. They do resort to political violence. And so this becomes a way of delegitimizing the struggle that the anti-colonial movements are involved in. But it becomes a topic for global discussion, if you will, after the Munich incident. That is, after the Israeli athletes are taken hostage by a Palestinian group, and in the midst of the sort of shootout that follows, the Israeli athletes are killed. And this, of course, creates global attention to this issue. And the UN General Assembly would then get together to have a meeting to pass a resolution about what to think about this question. I won't go into it in too much detail, but suffice it to say that there was a huge debate between formerly colonized nations versus colonial powers as to what constitutes terrorism. Now, formerly colonized nations, which are now calling themselves part of the non-aligned movement, argue that the pursuit of political violence in the interests of self-determination, in the interests of national self-determination, is legitimate. And what we have to condemn is state terrorism. What we have to condemn is what the United States was doing in Vietnam, where over 2 million civilians were killed at the behest of the US military. What we have to do is condemn South African apartheid, Israeli apartheid, and so on and so forth. Eventually, by the way, the resolution gets passed, which was put forward by the decolonized nations, saying that terrorism is mainly state terrorism. Now, many former colonies are unhappy about this. And so there would be a process of debate in order to shift this definition away so that today we don't think of terrorism as state terrorism, right? We think of terrorism as individual acts of violence committed by certain groups of people. There's a long history to how this actually happened. Suffice it to say that Israel and the Likud party, and particularly Benjamin Netanyahu and a group called an institute called the Jonathan Institute, would play an instrumental role in organizing two conferences, one in Jerusalem in 1979 and the other in Washington, D.C. in 1984, where they invite world leaders and start to create a different notion of what terrorism is, elevating Israel's enemies to the enemies of the West and sort of defining this entire process. I won't go into too much detail. This is the next book I'm working on, but there's this interesting theory that gets floated with absolutely no proof, by the way. This scholar puts out a book saying that there is an international conspiracy of terrorist organizations led by the Soviet Union bent on destroying the West. And the CIA disproves it. The CIA says there's absolutely no basis for any of the arguments that this person is actually making. So there's some tension still within the security establishment at this point about this notion. But then we come into the 1990s, and we have the World Trade Center bombing, the Kenya, the Tanzania bombings, and so on, so much so that by the time 1995 happens, which is the Oklahoma City bombing, the first response from so-called experts is, who's done it? Arabs have done this, Muslims have done this, and so on, when in fact it was our very homegrown terrorist, Timothy McVeigh. And so what you start to see is through the course of the 80s and into the 90s, what was the Arab terrorist would become the Islamic terrorist, and what used to be a sort of Cold War kind of conspiracy theory gives way to a new enemy. The new enemy, of course, after 9/11 would be the Islamic terrorist, right? So it's been a while in the making, and Hollywood has played no small role in propagandizing this particular image. Now, in the next book I'm working on, I'm also going to be looking at films that militate against this logic, because certainly there are those. But let's not forget that there is a long history of DoD, Department of Defense-sponsored films, Pentagon-sponsored films, CIA-sponsored films, and so on and so forth, which, by the way, earlier used to be an informal arrangement that used to be worked out between Hollywood and all of these security institutions. But after the passage of the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, it is now legal to propagandize to the American public, for the Pentagon to propagandize to the public, and to use public money to actually do so. So it's become even easier. So not only are we being spied on, we're being told we shouldn't worry about being spied on. So that's where we're at. So this is Hollywood.
This is a hijack!
Dr. Almar, does it say what God's command is?
To kill Americans.
It's your government we fight, not you. It's your White House. One day I will go there. I will drive a truck. And trach, it will blow.
You have killed our women and our children, bombed our cities from afar like cowards, and you dare to call us terrorists?
Amanda White's boyfriend.
Husband. Yeah, it was.
You didn't hear? She was in Paris showing the fall collection. She got hit by a burst of terrorist crossfire, Palestinians, French police.
Oh, my God. They found me. I don't know how, but they found me.
Run for it, Marty!
Who? Who do you think? The Libyans! Holy shit!
Attacking our way of life. They're attacking our way of life.
There's no borders, no customs. They can go anywhere in the U.S. There's nothing to stop them.
Don't wander into the Arab section, or you'll run into one of the Grand Mufti's gangsters and they'll kill you, son.
You get the idea. One of the drawbacks of being a critical media studies scholar is films you grew up loving, like Back to the Future. Now you watch them again, and it's just like, all right. What are you going to do? But I'm glad I do this work. I showed this clip, of course, to show that this has been the image that Hollywood has propagated. By doing that, I don't mean to say that the events of 9/11 didn't happen, or that there are sections of the Islamist movement that have Islamic fundamentalists that do resort to violence. But I want to put this into perspective. Because in fact, if you look at the actual threat posed by quote-unquote Islamic terrorism, it is as likely as a bolt of lightning striking you on your head. It's not just me making this up. So many studies about this. Sociologist Charles Kurzban, for instance, studies this in a lot of detail, and he shows that in the 10 years since 9/11, of the 150,000 murders that have taken place in the United States, Muslim Americans are responsible for a grand total of 33. That is less than 1%, right? Another sociologist, his book is John Mueller, his book is called Overblown, how politicians and terrorism experts hype the terrorist threat. In the foreword, he says, worldwide, the number of people who die from terrorism is about the same number of Americans every year who die from drowning in their bathtubs, right? So when you think about that, and you think about the minuscule number of people who are victims of terrorist violence, you have to ask the question, why is this so important? Why is this threat heightened to the extent that it is? And I think the best example, that to me at least, is going back to the era of the Cold War. Some of you have gray hair, so maybe you'll remember this, but there used to be a drill called duck and cover, where kids were taught in preparation for a nuclear attack from the Soviet Union to duck underneath their desks and cover their heads. You should watch this video. I show it in my classes. It's Bert the turtle, who's this really cute, adorable turtle who recoils into his shell as a way to protect himself from attacks, and that's what children are being taught. Now, obviously, ducking under your desk isn't really going to protect you from a nuclear attack, and so what's the point of this? The point of this is to carry out ritualistically fear-mongering, right? You keep doing this again and again, you're going to somewhere in the back of your mind be scared enough that you give your consent to both the hot and the Cold War with the Soviet Union, as well as the policing of dissent right here in the United States in the form of McCarthyism, the witch hunts, the blacklists, and so on and so forth. And so that's what this is. I'm calling this terrorism theater in my next book, because if you look again at the research of the number of foiled terror plots, there's a new book by Trevor Aronson called The Terror Factory, which shows that many of these terror plots are actually instigated by the FBI. They go into communities, they pick on vulnerable people, they even give them the ammunitions, dummy ammunitions, right? And then when they're about to carry this out, they give them money, they do all sorts of things. And when they're about to carry it out, all of a sudden, the police are there to apprehend them. Yes, yet another terror plot foiled. This is what happened with the Newburgh Four, these four poor African-American Muslim men who get entrapped into carrying out this attack on a synagogue in Harlem. And then suddenly there are cameras to picture them, and the mayor and the police commissioner are sort of patting themselves on the back about how they saved New Yorkers. And this happens, of course, again and again. Now, let me start to come to a close with this. And that is, I mentioned earlier that the white man's burden, in fact, has been revived. Instead of half devil, half child, we have half terrorist, half victim. And victims tend to be generally brown women. It tend to be Muslim women, right? And so here are the dominant images that we see, particularly from the Afghan war, of Afghan women, incredibly oppressed, isolated. Look at her body language. She's scared. She clearly needs to be rescued. Even when she's with her sisters, this is how they stand. They stand in body postures that are crouching, that are afraid, as opposed to with confidence standing up and looking at the people taking this picture. But in fact, this is not the case. That is to say, I'm not saying that Muslim women who live in Muslim-majority countries don't face oppression. Of course they do. Women all over the world face sexism. They just happen to face it in different ways in different parts of the world. So right here in Texas, we have lost the right to abortion. If we don't control our bodies, we don't control our lives. Women in this country still earn about 70 to 75 cents to the man's dollar for the exact same job. There has been an epidemic of rape in the military, and so by no means are women in this country somehow liberated compared to women in other parts of the world. And therefore this idea, this imperialist feminist idea, is really one that serves a political agenda and not the agenda of rescuing women. In fact, Afghan women were far from rescued. I don't have the time to talk about it, but we can bring it up in discussion how for the vast majority of women who live in rural areas, the situation actually has deteriorated according to studies by human rights organizations. What we don't see, of course, is the agency of women. The fact that they are able to stand up for themselves. Groups like Rawa in Afghanistan resisted the US attack. They said, we can liberate ourselves, please don't come into this country, but their voices went unheeded. Here is a woman wearing a burqa. You expect her to be docile, but here she is out in Egypt in 2011 at the start of the uprising in that country. She's carrying a sign that says, down with Mubarak. Men and women were part of the Arab uprisings all over the Middle East, battling the cops, standing up for themselves, and fighting back. And in fact, in Turkey, in Taksim Square earlier this year, people know the Gezi Park protest that took place, right? It was about a lot of things. It was about economics, it was about the environment, and so on. But what is less known in the West is, in fact, that 50% of the protesters were women. And they actually raised a bunch of issues related to women's rights, such as reproductive rights, control over their bodies, and so on, something that I was going to bring up if I was in Turkey at this time, and they might have regretted inviting me. At any rate, let me come to a close with this. And that is, there is nothing natural about the image of the Muslim enemy. Rather, it is constructed, as I have shown, at particular historic moments in order to serve political interests. And therefore, fighting this isn't simply about educating people about Islam, which, as I argued earlier, this is about politics. This is really not about the religion. I claim to have no special erudition on Islam. I grew up with Muslim neighbors on both sides of my home. We celebrated, my parents are Hindu. I myself am not religious. We celebrated functions together and so on and so forth. But instead, since the events of 9/11, what really sort of bothered me and why I wrote this book and why I've been giving these lectures is a sort of caricature that passes as knowledge about Muslims. And it's funny, but in talk after talk, one of the things that the discussion raises and that I have to keep convincing people is that Muslims are actually just like everybody else. They're a complex and diverse group of people. There are good people, there are bad people, there are pleasant people, there are irritating people, there are interesting people, and there are frankly really boring people. So, it reflects the entire gamut of human characteristics and the entire gamut of political positions, from communist and anarchist to reactionary and fundamentalist, right? And so that complexity, unfortunately, is lost, and that is why we have to talk about this as a political issue. We have to raise the issue of oil not for US interest. I never thought I would agree with anything that Dick Cheney ever said, but there's one thing I agree with, and he said, whoever controls oil controls the world economy. And I think that's absolutely right. And therefore, the US's interests continue to be in the Middle East, this control over the flow of oil. And it's what necessitates this kind of, on the one hand, enemy image, on the other hand, the victim image. We need to go rescue them from the chemical strikes, et cetera, et cetera. Never mind that the US, of course, used chemical weapons in white phosphorus in 2004 in Iraq, depleted uranium after the 1991 Gulf War, which has led to birth defects, or its ally using white phosphorus, Israel using white phosphorus in Gaza, and so on and so forth. But these are the narratives that get put forward in order to win our consent. I was at the 50th anniversary in Washington, D.C. of the I Have a Dream speech, right? People did read about, how could you have not read about the I Have a Dream march? I wasn't there on Wednesday, I was there on Saturday, and I was listening to the speech again, and it's amazing. You know, even back in '63, King is just so much, what struck me is he was so much more radical in his demands than many of the people who were at the front of the room making speeches this past August. But I think a speech that didn't make it, and a thing that didn't actually sort of get mainstream media attention, is what he had to say about the Vietnam War. And what sort of, earned him a lot of wrath is when he said that he not only opposed the Vietnam War, but that in fact he called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence around the world. And that's the moment that he's no longer, the moderate that we can all adopt, and instead he becomes the radical that we should shun, and so forth. So I just wanted to end with that, because raising difficult questions and going against the grain is never easy. But I think we have an obligation to do that because we pay. We pay not only in terms of the trillions of dollars that is used to build up the national security state, by which I don't mean only wars. I also mean drones. I also mean the mass surveillance and so on and so forth. So we pay a price in terms of the quality of our lives, our ability to live in a democracy, and I think we've got to speak out against that at every opportunity we get. Thanks. The first question is, in what ways is the construction of the Muslim enemy different from both other racial groups like Native Americans and so on, as well as the Soviet Union? Let me answer that briefly. One could talk endlessly on this. But in the case of Cold War propaganda, actually I study the National Security Archives, and I've looked at some of the propaganda campaigns carried out by the US in the region. And it's so interesting is that back then, the United States emphasized its godly nature in opposition to the godless Soviet Union, right? In fact, there was a picture taken of a mosque right in Washington, D.C., and plastered all over the Middle East, saying, we too are religious. Not only are we Christian, but we have Muslims here, and we're just like you, so please, please don't listen to the Soviet Union and its rotten propaganda and all the rest of it. So in that context, there was a slightly different sort of connotation. There are commonalities in terms of racial others. So, for instance, the idea of Arab men in particular, brown men in particular, being sort of these lustful predators who are out to rape women, who want to buy particularly blonde American women to make up their harems. That has been, a theme that we've seen at least over the last century, and it gets repeated again, by the way, in a show called Homeland, if you haven't seen that, where a young woman is actually recruiting for a particular harem. It's a complex show, that show, but you have this theme coming up again. What does this have to do with African Americans and Native Americans? Well, going back to the genocide of Native Americans, one of the arguments and justifications that were given is that the Native Americans want to rape white women, and they are kidnapping our women, and so we have to prove our manliness by vanquishing them. In the post-Civil War era, during the period of Reconstruction, during the birth of the Klan and so forth, the myth of the black rapist is the one that's used to actually put down freed slaves in the South. Angela Davis writes about this really beautifully in her book, Women, Race, Class? Is that the name of the book? I'm forgetting. So yes, there are similarities, because how new can you be? Every time there's an enemy, you can't keep making this up again and again. So you've got to rely on some old tropes, but at the same time, there are differences as well. the Arab uprisings. I don't like to use that term Arab Spring. The question was, how has this image changed since the Arab Spring of 2011? The term Arab Spring is problematic because it tries to contain what are deep-seated grievances that led to these uprisings, first in Tunisia, then in Egypt, then Syria, Bahrain, and so on and so forth, to one season, spring. And somehow it's over after that, when in fact it's not. And revolutions are long processes, and they take time. Look at what happened after the French Revolution. You had a reaction, you had a period of dictatorship, Bonapartism, and then you had the reactionary right come into being, and it's a long process that takes place. So I don't like the term spring. Now, how has that changed this image? I think the key change that it has produced is among activists. So Occupy Wall Street activists, for instance, and I live near Manhattan. I live not near Wall Street, but I live near downtown Manhattan, and I got to go many times to Occupy Wall Street. And it was so amazing to hear people talk about being inspired by the events in Tahrir Square. In fact, the idea of occupying public spaces is one that you may say began with the uprisings in Egypt and with the occupation of Tahrir Square. And then it spread to Pearl Square in Manama, Bahrain. And then you see its reflections in Europe, in Puerto del Sol, in Madrid, in Madrid, Spain. You see that in Athens, Syntagma Square, and then all over the world. And so among people who are articulating a politics of resistance against the 1%, there is a recognition that that 1% is international and that we're all on the same side. So I think among that group of people, the sort of white man's burden idea has largely been defined. But in the mainstream, I'm not that optimistic about that. Finally, is there a sickness in American society that makes us more susceptible to this kind of paranoia? I think it's fear. I mean, I speak to intelligent audiences all the time, and people are stunned when I give the statistic about how you are more likely to be killed from a strike or a bolt of lightning than terrorism. People don't know that. And as a result of that, their attention has been drawn to a particular kind of danger that exists around them. And in case you forget, anytime you travel, there is not only a military presence, there's not only a police presence, but you now also have a military presence, right? There's the militarization of the police that has taken place, and you have boards that say, if you see something, say something, but nobody needs to teach us anymore what this something is, because it's already become part of our consciousness. So I can't answer your question quickly, but this is actually why I'm writing the next book about the naturalization, the banalization of the national security state through popular culture, through political discourse. What do I think about Syria in a nutshell? What do I think about Obama's response to Syria? The Arab uprisings, as I said earlier, are a genuine popular set of uprisings led by different groups of people across the Middle East. And one of the things that unites all of these protests, all of these uprisings, is a desire for genuine political participation, democracy, as well as an anger towards the growing polarization between the very rich, who have benefited from the introduction of neoliberal policies and who have become, a really bloated 1%, versus everybody else who is getting poorer and poorer. And so when Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in Tunisia and sort of sparked, if you will, the uprisings elsewhere, it really symbolized this. This was the fruit vendor, right? He was forbidden from selling his fruit, and in protest, he set himself on fire. And that is emblematic of the grievances that people have in various countries, led, by the way, by allies of the United States, such as Ben Ali, such as Mubarak. In fact, up until the last minute, Obama and Hillary Clinton in particular were backing Mubarak. Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton are actually close family friends with the Mubaraks. And you may have seen, of course, also in Syria, the picture that has been floating on Facebook where John Kerry and Assad and their two spouses are having dinner barely last year, right? And that's because Assad has successfully introduced neoliberal reforms, and they were, quite happy with the things that he was actually doing. So, what is the US's position? Again, in a nutshell, there's a lot of history here. Well, the position is to let both sides fight each other to the death, to maintain the stalemate. This is why initially the proposal was limited strikes, but no regime change, right? Because right now, even though the US is backing various forces in Syria, it doesn't actually trust anybody to take over from Assad and act in a way that actually advances the US's interests. In fact, the way that the Obama administration put it is they want the Yemen solution for Syria. What does that mean? That means just get rid of the dictator and put in another person, somebody else, but don't actually change the regime, don't actually change the way things are actually functioning. And so in that sense, the Obama administration's policies globally, really, in terms of foreign policy, has been no different from that of the Bush administration. What has changed fundamentally, though, is rhetoric, right? When Obama came to power, in fact, even before Obama came to power, the Bush administration was realizing that its sort of cowboy rhetoric, clash of civilizations, is not only losing friends in the Middle East and in the rest of the world, but even among allies. Do you remember they called them freedom fries and old Europe and all the rest of it? Polls showed that the US's image on the world stage was dragged through the mud. And so already there was an effort to try to win hearts and minds. This was the Petraeus doctrine, the counterinsurgency doctrine, the idea of, let's go build infrastructure, let's try to learn the languages of these people, and so on and so forth. And so Obama inherits that shift in language. In fact, there's a policy group a full year before he comes to power that says one of the first things that a new president should do is denounce the clash of civilizations rhetoric. And that's exactly what he does. He goes off to Egypt, and denounces the clash of civilizations. But while we've seen a rhetorical shift, in reality, the policies haven't really changed. If anything, they've become more secretive. We now have drone strikes that none of us actually know about. And casualties don't get counted because the Obama administration has changed the terms of who is considered a casualty. So all military-age men in Muslim-majority countries are automatically considered suspects unless proved posthumously after their deaths that they're innocent. So casualty counts have gone down even though drone strikes have gone up. You get the idea. So even though he's accused of being a Muslim by the far right, the far right in this country has grown quite a bit actually during the Obama era, and at least in part that has to do with the fact that his administration has not taken a principled defense against Islamophobia. I don't know, if somebody accused me of being a Muslim, I wouldn't say, oh, no, I'm Hindu. I go to the same temple every week. Because if I do that, what does it say? It says that there's something wrong with being Muslim. Instead, if I were Obama and I was accused, I would say, you know what? I have relatives who are Muslim. I don't have any problem with that. I myself am Christian, and I've been going to the same. But when you take this sort of defensive posture, it allows the far right to be even more emboldened. Can religion be used to justify anything? And I'll combine that with your question of how al-Qaeda turns to the Quran to actually justify violence. Now, at the broadest level, any of the world's religious books, except perhaps the religious texts of Buddhism or Jainism, but certainly the other main religions of the world, Christianity included, can be interpreted in a variety of ways. So Christian fundamentalists, for instance, will turn to the Old Testament to justify violence. At the same time, you have pacifists within the Christian tradition who also turn to Jesus Christ as a revolutionary, as someone who stood up for the poor and the oppressed against the elite. So religion and the way that it gets used and interpreted really depends on who is doing the using and the interpreting. But in terms of the Quran itself, again, I'm not a Quranic scholar, I'm not a religious scholar, but the way I've been given to understand, based on the work of people who do this scholarship, Mahmoud Mamdani to some extent, but others as well, is that there are two meanings of the word jihad, right? The greater meaning of the word jihad is to struggle within oneself in order to live in the ways of God. The lesser struggle, the lesser jihad, is the struggle against the other. And it is largely a self-defensive kind of struggle. But what happens is in the last 3 decades of the 20th century, there are new interpretations, there are political interpretations of Islam that come into being all over, in various different contexts. In the Shia context, Ayatollah Khomeini, for instance, takes what is largely a pacifist, quietist religion, where they say, Shia's Islam says religion should play no part in politics, right? The two spheres are different, and that's how it's been for over a millennium. But Khomeini, drawing on other scholars, would reappropriate that and say, no, we absolutely have to play a political part, right? So there's a sort of re-theorization of Islam for political goals. And that happens, of course, also in the Sunni religion, in the Sunni branch of Islam in all sorts of ways. So there also would argue that this does not represent, for instance, the Islam that they practice. And of course, for each person, it's a different question. But ultimately, this is not unique. Even in India, Hindus would, the RSS, and Snehal knows a lot more about the politics of Hindu fundamentalism than I do, but suffice it to say that they similarly appropriate a certain kind of tradition of Hinduism in order to justify violence against Muslims. Same thing in Israel. You see the rise of Jewish fundamentalists around the 1970s who similarly turn to these sorts of violence and say that it comes out of Judaism and so forth. So should we live in a secular world where we forbid religion? Absolutely not. I think religion is a private matter, and we should absolutely defend the right of people to practice whatever religion or not practice religion or practice just spirituality or whatever it is. People have different reasons for being spiritual. We live in a society where we turn to all sorts of things in order to make our life meaningful in all sorts of ways. And finally, Pearl Harbor, Japan, can we get to that point where who was that who asked that? Yeah. Can we get to the point where we no longer think of Muslims in that way? Now, after Pearl Harbor, people know that Japanese Americans, over 100,000, actually, they were not all Japanese Americans, the vast majority were, but anyone of Japanese descent was rounded up and put into internment camps. And these were horrible places, by the way. If you read some of the documents on it, there was no plumbing. These were like makeshift places where young, old, everyone was just thrown in, and the keys were thrown away and so forth. Let's see, almost 4 decades later, the Reagan administration issued an apology to Japanese Americans. Why? Because Reagan was this fantastic progressive who opposed racism? Of course not. But it's because geopolitically, by that time, Japan was no threat to the United States on the global stage. And so there was no need to mobilize any kind of antagonism towards the Japanese. And what's so comical, if it wasn't so sad, is that at the same time that these images are being repudiated against Japanese Americans, you see the rise of anti-Chinese sentiment, particularly among neoconservatives who, after the Cold War, start to see China as the next great rival to the United States. And of course, the Obama administration and its pivot to China is sort of reflecting some of that attitude. So no, as long as the Middle East continues to hold oil, and as long as oil is central to world economic development, I don't think that these ideas are going to disappear. I think that the best chance that we have is, as citizens of this country who have no interest in this kind of racism, is by building social movements to actually fight back against this, by holding meetings like this, by holding teach-ins, by protesting every time the far right actually shows up somewhere to demonize a religious minority, to denounce the kind of ads that were taken out in the campus newspaper here, and to stand in solidarity with our Muslim and Arab and South Asian brothers and sisters. People know this ruling, right, where Texas teachers now have to teach about 9/11 and about radical Islam and so forth. So here's what I said. I said, it's not that we shouldn't teach about 9/11, and it's not that we shouldn't mention that this was the work of Islamic fundamentalists, but I think we have to do that in a contextual way. And that means a couple of things. One, that we contextualize Islamic fundamentalism within the context of the rise of all sorts of fundamentalisms, right? Whether it's Baruch Goldstein in Jerusalem killing people who are going to a mosque, Jewish fundamentalist, whether it's the Shiv Sena carrying out pogroms against Muslims in Gujarat, And how many people were killed?
2,000?
2,000 Muslims were killed in Gujarat. Over 10,000 were displaced out of that situation. Or we're talking about Christian fundamentalists. Absolutely, let's teach about all these tragedies, and let's also teach about 9/11 in that context. Second context, where did Al-Qaeda come from? Why is it that these people have the skills, the training, and the know-how to be able to carry out not only attacks in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Algeria, and so on and so forth, but in the United States? Well, for that we have to go back to 1979, when the United States decided to arm, train, and fund to the tune of billions with a B, $5 billion is a conservative estimate, the Mujahideen. These are the holy warriors. These are Islamic fundamentalists who get brought together, not only people who are in Afghanistan, but in fact, Osama bin Laden is a CIA asset. He is toured around the Middle East, Osama bin Laden being the Saudi billionaire, who then recruits from across the Middle East, from Algeria, from Egypt, and so on. And they get assembled in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, for the first time, a group of people who have pretty radical ideas, pretty sort of, fundamentalist ideas, and then systematically trained by first the CIA in the United States. Stephen Cole and other journalists have written about this, and then by the ISI, the Pakistani ISI in Pakistan, all sorts of skills that they normally would not have had. So these are, sort of the extreme wings in their own countries. They get brought together, they get trained, care of our money as well as matching funds from Egypt, Israel, and elsewhere. And here comes an entire group of people who are born out of this effort, and Al-Qaeda comes out of this. Al-Qaeda is the group that comes out of the Mujahideen. And this is not an exception. In fact, right from 1958, from the Eisenhower Doctrine, as I explain in the book, once it was determined that the secular nationalist regimes of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, secular nationalism, by the way, has been the dominant sort of political ideology in the Middle East, at least for the last 2 centuries, right? The parties of political Islam are a fairly recent phenomenon. Once it is realized that these folks cannot be co-opted, part of the Eisenhower Doctrine is to place Islam on the political stage, and in particular, the Saudi king. They want an Islamic pope, as they put it in policy circles, to serve as a beacon of attraction away from secular nationalism. And so this has resulted in support of all sorts of groups, from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt to groups that would go on to support Khomeini in 1979, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to say that, this is also a product of blowback. Blowback is a term that the CIA coined, which is the unintended consequences of US actions around the world, particularly covert actions, and this is what actually happens. So if we want to educate people about 9/11, let's give them a real education, free of propaganda, so that they know not to give their consent to things like this. I think the way that Seymour Hersh, the journalist, you know him, right? He broke My Lai in Vietnam, the massacre that took place there. And the way he put it, he came to give a lecture at my university, and he said when he was reporting from Afghanistan, he met this young 12 or 13-year-old boy who had just joined the Taliban. And he went and spoke to him, and he said, why did you join the Taliban? He said, well, I was going to a wedding, and a US strike killed my entire family. Now I have nothing left but to get rid of the United States and to get rid of NATO. That is what happens. Those are the consequences of raining deaths on ordinary people who otherwise would go ahead and have normal lives. And instead, sadly, we are the ones who pay a price, right? It's ordinary people who were in the Twin Towers who actually gave their lives as a result of the strikes that happened then. Now, post 9/11. Well, how do we get past 9/11? One of the reasons why it keeps getting dragged up, and the cry from over a century ago was, remember the Maine. Do you remember do you know about the Maine incident? This was the USS Maine was stationed off the harbor of Cuba, And it was blown up. There was an explosion, and historians to date do not agree as to whether the Spanish actually played a role in the blowing up of the USS Maine. A lot of historians have come down on the side that there was some sort of internal combustion. So it was never clear why this actually exploded. But yellow journalism, the Hearst newspapers, jumped on this, and a certain section of the political class realized the propaganda value, which is, let us blame this on the Spanish and let us take the nation into the Spanish-American War. So remember the Maine, remember the Maine. And the second part of it, if you know remember the Maine, the second part of it is what? Anyone know? To hell with Spain, right? And so that's the way in which this keeps getting repeated again and again. How do we get past that? And I want to tie that into who will be targeted next and answer the two together. I think the pivot to Asia gives us a sense. People know, right? This is the sort of next policy sort of shift that the Obama administration has taken. It was part of his defense planning guidance document released in January of 2012. And it's about focusing on China as the emerging power to actually rival US hegemony on the world stage. And so of course, militarily, China is not even a patch on the United States in terms of how much money it spends on its military and so on. But it's the projection that down the road, China could actually present a real threat to US hegemony on the world stage, which potentially could mean that that would be sort of the next target, if you will. So how do we get past? By what you said, I'm assuming, how do we get past the creation of enemies? How do we get past racism? How do we get past these narratives that, psychologically or socially we keep accepting again and again? And I have to turn to social movements. What is it that ended the Vietnam War? It was a number of things. It was the fact that the US couldn't win, 68, and the Tet Offensive. Actually showed that, the story that was being told by the government at the time, that we're winning, just wait, send some more soldiers, not true. The Tet Offensive actually showed that the US couldn't win the war, so that was one part of it. But a large part of it was social movements. It was students, it was activists, it was soldiers who were coming back, who were returning from Vietnam, saying that we have been told lies. And that, their demonstrations, their teach-ins, they had teach-ins that would go on from morning to night. People would sleep, and then they would wake up the next morning, and then they would engage in, writing about this and bringing out publications and changing an entire generation and their attitudes towards militarism, towards war, and towards racism. Because keep in mind, this is not simply a time when the Vietnam War and the resistance against this was going on. This was also the context of the civil rights movement and then the Black Power movement. And think about the profound impact that the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement would have on this country. Some of the polls from back in the 1960s, when asked, would you live next to an African American? Would you accept an African American as your neighbor? And the answer was about 90% of people, particularly those in the South, said no. Today, the same poll is exactly the opposite. It's not to say that racism is gone, as we saw from the Trayvon Martin verdict and responses to that and so on and so forth, but we've certainly come a long way in terms of the attitudes that we have. And so how do we fundamentally shift from the kinds of poisons that we keep getting fed from our leadership, is we create a different kind of knowledge from the bottom up. We articulate our own interests, which quite frankly are very different from the interests of the people at the top of the society, right? And we articulate a completely different agenda about what is in our interest. And that's the basis, I think, on which we can go into a post-9/11, a post-9/11 movement, but more importantly, a post-imperial moment, a moment where it's a society that's based on democracy, on economic equality, and the end to racism, homophobia, sexism, and all of the ills that divide all of us and keep us separated. Thanks.